Okay, we're about to introduce Robert Steinberger-Wilckens from Birmingham University, and he's going to talk to us for 20 minutes about the third of our white papers, which is to do with hydrogen fuel cells and energy security. That's been implicit in some of what's been said in the previous two presentations, but now energy security is moving center stage. Robert, over to you.
Good. Thanks, Paul. So good morning, everybody. So obviously between the three topics there is some overlap, and so I'll be repeating a bit of what has been said already, although with different words, so it won't be as bad as you might think now. So there's no thing like a 5-minute break. So we did this work, so essentially Jonathan Radcliffe and Nasser Al-Mufahi from Birmingham Energy Institute, or University of Birmingham, with Paul Dodds, Owain, and Anthony from UCL, so Anthony again, and Zeynep also contributed the policy chapter. So what was the scope of the report? We wanted to look into what hydrogen, and that's hydrogen and fuel cells, of course, contribute to the energy security in the UK. And so that entails things like who actually profits from this, who is it for whom is the energy security delivered, and what are essentially the risks and the values you're trying to secure here. So there's different levels in here, and if you look at the documents of the government, a lot of it is about cost to the consumer and threats to supply. But you'll see that the effects we're showing here are much broader. So first thing, of course, was to set up something like a definition, because everybody seems to know what energy security is, but if you drill down to what the actual definition is, you find there's not much agreement. So we adopted this approach, and essentially you can see there's things like long-term and short-term. So there's the resilience, so what happens if there's any impact on the energy system, energy infrastructure, like flooding or natural disasters or any sort of malevolent interference. So say any cyber attack or terrorist attack. Robustness, we then said, is the long term. So what happens if there's shifts in resources in energy, access to resources. And then there's the two aspects of short-term economy, like the cost to consumer. But then we also speak about the cost to the society as a whole, and then the long-term perspective, where you're looking at sustainability, which is also about finances, investment, and long-term securing of investments. Now, the first thing that comes to mind with hydrogen is there's a plethora of different energy sources or inputs or feedstock, whatever you want to call it, you can use as an input. So you can produce hydrogen from electricity, you can produce hydrogen from hydrocarbons, you can produce it from waste, from biomass, or even by algae, from sunlight, essentially, if you like, and a little bit of sugar. So, and there's many more ways, and there's different processes. So you have a very broad range of ways of producing hydrogen and a broad range of energy sources you can get access to. So that's important, because you'll see on one of the next slides how hydrogen can become something like a central node of the energy system, energy infrastructure. And now you have different ways of feeding into this. So you can take anything from electricity to, if you like, natural gas, crude oil, by partial oxidation, lots of other things. Could be renewable, could be non-renewable. You could be employing CCS or not. You just get a selection and a choice you didn't have before. And a lot of these energy sources, if you look at the renewable energy, of course, will be indigenous. So you rely on imports much less than you do today. So although UK has access to gas and oil from the North Sea, I mean, when Scotland leaves, that's gone, so England won't have these resources. But even so, that's dwindling away. So even if we used enhanced oil recovery, within the next 20 or 30 years, this will be gone. So on these timescales, we have to look at what happens then. And renewable energies, of course, are harvested within the country. And that also has implications, as was sort of hinted before in the previous talk, has implications on the national economy. plus then the price volatility, of course, on the world markets you don't have for renewable energy. So that's a long-term securing of cost. So this is what the current markets look like. So it was mentioned, but were not shown as a graph before. So essentially we're closing circles here. There's completely separate markets for gas, which you could say heating. Some of the gas, of course, also goes into electricity supply, more so in the UK than in other countries, less coal. And then we have a completely separate market for transport fuels. Of course, there's, especially in the UK, there's quite an overlap. There's quite a lot of electric heating. Of course, very inefficient, but then very cheap to install. And the future system could look like this. So essentially, hydrogen can supply all of this. So you could feed lots of different sources into hydrogen, and from this hydrogen supply chain or infrastructure, you could feed the heating market, the electricity market, and the transport market. One thing to point out here is we're not only talking about hydrogen, we're also talking about synthetic fuels or synthetic natural gas, because we can turn hydrogen into methane. So we can have a methanization, and we can produce synthetic natural gas out of methane. That's one of the beauties of using hydrogen, because it has these electrochemical conversion pathways. So we needn't even turn all of the infrastructure into a hydrogen infrastructure, which would not be totally impossible, because a lot of the infrastructure comes from the times where we had town gas, which was 50% of hydrogen. So implicitly it was built for a hydrogen economy, if you like. Not all of it. So there's been several projects, especially at EU level, looking into this. So naturally, for instance, roughly 10 years ago, looked into this and found that there is some issues, but they can easily be overcome. So we could also turn the hydrogen, at least in places, into synthetic natural gas, feed that into the grid, and you reuse the infrastructure as it is today. So the investment on changing the infrastructure would be zero. The investment goes into the conversion of the hydrogen. Now, one thing that has been mentioned, but maybe let's look at it at a more technical level here. The complementary technology to hydrogen is fuel cells. So a fuel cell will turn hydrogen into electricity and heat, electrochemically, no thermal process involved, so we're not limited in efficiency. Thermal process, so any steam turbine, any thermal process in a thermal power station, including nuclear, is always limited by the Carnot efficiency, which essentially is a function of the temperatures. So the higher the temperature, the better the efficiency, and the lower the temperature you reject to, so essentially the environment, the better. So you can only achieve 100% efficiency in a thermal power station if you work between the sun and the universe. So 6,000 Kelvin versus 0. Obviously that's not possible on Earth, so we're stuck with something like 56%. And a thermal power station or any thermal machine, engine, whatever, is not able to surpass that. The fuel cell is not limited. So theoretically, if we incredibly improved the materials, we could go up to anything above 90%. I wouldn't say 100, but theoretically there's no limit. So even a very small fuel cell system of 1 kilowatt or 2 kilowatts, so a system you put into a house, has the same electrical efficiency as the best combined cycle gas turbine station, 60%. So we work on a totally different scale, and we can bring this very large unit, high efficiency, into very small applications. And the fuel cell is based on membranes, so if you want more power, you just increase the surface, whereas a thermal power station is based on volume, so you only get the very high efficiency if you have very large power stations. Plus, these fuel cells can digest a vast range of different fuels. So we can work on hydrogen, that's the simplest. It's not necessarily the most efficient. We can also work on methane, so natural gas essentially. That's more efficient. We can work on mixtures of hydrogen with something else, like carbon monoxide, which is a flammable gas. We can also work on propane, methanol, ethanol. So there's a wide range of different gases, so we can also include biogas, which is a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide. All that can be fed into a fuel cell directly and directly be converted with no further processing. You can have fuel cells that need processing, you can have some without, so you have a vast choice of different fuels at relatively high efficiencies. Now the other thing is, if we have these very small units, we're sort of bringing down the electricity supply or energy supply, if you like, from the level of very centralized units. So you always have these gigawatt units because you want the high efficiency, or at least half a gigawatt or something like that. We bring the same level down to kilowatt level, or anything above that. So we sort of fill this gap. And then, of course, if you have 1,000,000 1 kilowatt units instead of a gigawatt centralized plant, you're distributing that all across the country, so you reduce the distribution losses. So that's the same philosophy you have behind the micro CHP today, just small engine or whatever, gas-driven. Can do the same with a fuel cell at higher efficiency. So small gas engine CHP unit would have something like 30% efficiency, and we can double that. A distributed system inherently is more robust or resilient. If there's any disturbance, it can restart again more reliably. So it's like a swarm. And you can also install what you call black start capability. So if a mid-voltage line, a major transmission line fails, for instance for weather, so if you have snow and ice on the lines, they break, you get a large area of the country blacking out and disconnected from electricity supply. And with distributed generation, as long as it gets a 50 hertz signal from somewhere, so it can start with the grid frequency, and that can be implemented, you can restart the grid from these distributed units, and you can sort of block off single parts of the grid. The easiest bit is you can supply single homes. So as long as there's still a fuel supply, which also is a risk. I mean, if electricity fails, mostly you'll also have the gas grid failing because of the controls still running on electricity. Not always, but sometimes. So you could at least keep up the electricity supply for single homes on the basis of having the CHP unit in the home. So you'd be able to secure supply and be able to come on grid much faster than if you had to wait for the transmission lines to be repaired. And this can actually take weeks. So there's been instances where due to winter weather, lines have come down, it's taken 3 weeks to bring back electricity in the middle of winter, so that's really critical. Now there's also an enabling aspect. So once you have a fuel cell on an electric vehicle, you have a tank with hydrogen, you have an energy vector, a fuel, if you like, a fuel tank. You turn this fuel into electricity on the vehicle to drive it or extend the range, but you could also use it as an electricity generator. So essentially you plug your tools, if you're a workman, or you plug your house into the vehicle and it gets supplied from the vehicle. Something you can't do with a normal vehicle. So it's adding a new aspect to the energy system. So again, you could see this as an uninterruptible power supply or backup power for buildings. So even if you don't have a micro CHP plant, you have a fuel cell vehicle, the grid fails, you plug in your vehicle, and roughly you could run the house two days off the vehicle, maybe 3 days. So the other aspect is linking of the gas and the electricity system. You can turn electricity into hydrogen. The hydrogen you could feed into the gas grid, and this hydrogen or methane, if you like, you can take out of the gas grid and produce electricity. So essentially you're linking the two. But there's also another aspect. You can reverse the function of a fuel cell and it turns into an electrolyzer. So it's electrochemically, it's just the reverse process. Thermodynamically, they would be in balance, so you just sort of switch around from producing electricity to consuming electricity, so driving the fuel cell, and would be an electrolyzer producing hydrogen from water. Now theoretically that's possible at a low temperature range, so if you look at the low temperature fuel cells, the typical polymer electrolyte fuel cells, it does work, but it doesn't work too well. If you look at the higher temperature fuel cells, like solid oxide fuel cells, work perfectly. So essentially a solid oxide fuel cell you can drive forward, backward, and it works fine. So we're still looking into how long this will be the case, but at least for a year you can actually do this. So you have the same device that would be producing electricity from hydrogen or methane, and the same device that in reverse can turn the water that is produced into hydrogen. So this gives you immediately the opportunity for instance, balancing power in grids that have a very high proportion of renewable electricity. It's a very fast reacting technology because it's just electrochemistry. So you can absorb excess and you can immediately also supply to the grid. So there's two functions you can't have without this. It's the linking of the gas and the electricity grid, and it's also the balancing power you can supply to renewable electricity. So that's what you call power to gas. So that's one key word. So ITM in Sheffield is very strong in this. It's one of the world-leading companies who's promoting this. Power to gas used to be something else. Now it's sort of power to hydrogen. It used to be power to methane. But still, that's also included in here. So again, you have the possibility of producing hydrogen, feeding that into the grid, and then you have the problems of how much you can mix in or how you convert. Or you produce methane, and then you just feed it into the grid as if it was natural gas. And then you have the heating market, you have the electricity market, and the transport market all wrapped up into one large complex entity. Now, just to make things slightly more complicated, this is something we're also working on in Birmingham. So say we have biomass, we can turn it into substitute natural gas, so biogas, methane and carbon dioxide with anaerobic digestion. We can also, and then clean it up, put it into the gas grid, or we have gasification, we get a syngas, we go through methanization into the gas grid. That's what you do today with biomass. And then we have a high temperature fuel cell and directly use that gas to produce electricity and heat. Or we can also, in this fuel cell, also use these gases directly. We can directly take on biogas without purification. It saves us a lot of energy. And on the other hand, we can use electricity to produce the same syngas. So we use water and carbon dioxide and produce syngas, and that goes into methanation and goes into the natural gas grid. So essentially we get on the right side an electrochemical cycle. We can take water and carbon dioxide, turn that into gas, and turn it back into water and carbon dioxide, and use the atmosphere as the storage, and the same on the left. So the water and carbon dioxide goes into biomass, slightly different time scale, and comes back into the system as energy. So essentially we're using the atmosphere as the storage for this, and we have an electrochemical cycle on the right side and photosynthesis on the left. So we have a complete zero carbon energy cycle. The only energy, if we still need the fossil energy, is in the first instance for making all the appliances we need here. Now, what's the cost of all this? So Paul's been going into the details of this. This is, I'll be coming back to that on the next slide also. Cost is a bit tricky. So everybody thinks they know what cost is, but if you drill down to what actually is wrapped up in this, it gets a bit more difficult. So this is a model of looking into what the cost of hydrogen production would be if there was a 250 pounds per ton carbon dioxide tax. It's relatively obvious if there's no carbon dioxide tax, hydrogen will be more expensive because the environmental benefit we have by only releasing water by burning hydrogen is not valorized in any way. So nobody's paying us for that. So obviously it has to be more expensive. But if you take this into account and you see there's one negative value here, so if you take biomass and you use CCS, if that ever comes online, you're actually earning money. So hydrogen gets cheaper because it's avoiding more carbon dioxide and you're cashing in on the carbon dioxide tax. And the fossil fuels don't come out cheaper. So normally they'd always come out cheaper because they're available, there's lots of tax credits, and they're not paying the full cost of service that we see in the moment. So in this case, when the carbon dioxide emissions are taxed appropriately, the picture changes, and hydrogen is completely competitive. Now, what is in cost? Normally, you just have the pump price, as you call it. So pump price is what you pay at a petrol pump, is what you pay for energy services. And this is just the cost of supplying the energy by all the companies along the supply chain. But there's a lot of cost connected to the usage of the energy. For instance, if you take the example of a vehicle, there's all the emissions of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, NOx, particles, whatever. There's mercury from coal-fired power stations, radioactivity from coal-fired power stations. Smog in larger cities like London. If you actually put price tags on all this, like 19,000 premature deaths per year or something like that, if you put price tags on that, the picture changes. And that's things that are not paid by the driver of the vehicle. They're paid by, let's say, society. So what's said in this country, there's no thing like society. Let's say the state, nation pays this, taxpayer pays it, and we pay it with our own health. So those are costs you call externalities. They're not in the market price, but they belong there because hydrogen fuel cell technologies don't cause a lot of these. So if there's just water released in the city, you won't have the smog in the city. You might have the emissions in a different place where you're producing the hydrogen from natural gas, but it's not concentrated at the point of use. And then, of course, you can also produce the hydrogen from other sources. So, and this is real money, it's not fancy. So health, you could, of course, argue, and there's differences. So in the US, life is a different value than it is in the UK. I think it's factor 100 more. So it's £20,000 here, and it's $1 million in the US. But a lot of the cost is actually taxpayer compensations, and it's cost for all kinds of things that we pay in one way or the other. So if you look at that picture, so this is an example of running a hydrogen vehicle. So it's a Mercedes A-Class, it's something real on the streets with the real efficiency, is about 15 pounds per 100 kilometers, and it's about 8 pounds for diesel. So that is a factor of 2 by 1, and that's just the pump price. If you add the external costs, which have been quantified, so lots of studies on that, it's about a factor of 2 for the diesel, so it's another 100% on top. There's also external costs for hydrogen, of course, but they're much less, so you have something like 1 by 1. So if you look at the total cost, hydrogen is competitive. Only that's not the view we have today. It's not the view we have as consumers, but the state, the government should have this view because the state is actually shelling out this money. So, and then of course there's some variance in the external costs. It will differ whether you're in London or whether you're somewhere in the Highlands, of course. But if you take this view, cost has a different meaning. And as we're talking to policymakers here, this is essentially the view you have to take here. Now just summing up things slightly, so what we see here is a much more complicated system than we have up to now. It's very simple in that we have this hinge of hydrogen, but then all this input and the output is much more complicated. The flows are more complicated. You can get the input to the hydrogen from all kinds of different sources. So we envisage there has to be somebody who oversees this, not in the sense of regulation or more state control, but in the way of coordination. So if it's not clear whether the market signals, we need more hydrogen for this and that market, actually translate into we have to produce it from this or that source. Probably there has to be somebody who has an overview, like National Grid or something like that, who actually is a broker. So it could also be like an energy exchange platform. So we call that a system architect or also a clearinghouse. It's not more state control, it's just about the coordination and the optimum energy flow in the system. It's a more flexible system, so you have to look at more aspects in here. You have to have more than just looking at the heating market or the transport fuel market. You have to have a more holistic view. We need this level playing field, so we need some way of embracing the external cost. There will be a lot of investment. So typically in renewable energies, you invest a lot upfront, and then you have 20 years of essentially no further costs. So you have 20 years of stability of energy prices, which you don't have with fossil fuels, obviously. If you want to invest into this sort of future, you need a clear strategy by the government that this is the framework you will be working in. That's what the studies at EU level have been achieving. So essentially industry said, we have a study, that was the McKinsey one. The only thing we want from the EU is a clear regulatory framework. So we will not put any obstacles in the way of hydrogen fuel cells for the next 20 years. So industry, you can invest and you will not have any changes in the game. And then of course there's lots of different items where we still need research. So I'm not begging for more research funds here necessarily, but of course, as was said already, a lot of the fuel cell and hydrogen money comes from Brussels. And of course, if there's separation, we'll need other sources of this money. So just to answer the initial question, how can we contribute with hydrogen fuel cells to energy security? So there's definitely an increase in independence of energy imports. Energy imports also translates into exporting your GDP. So money earned here is exported to wherever oil and gas come from. You stabilize the economy by not exporting your income. And of course, by not relying on imports, you're also politically much more independent of the other parts of the world that may want to take some influence. So thinking of natural gas increasingly coming from Russia in the EU, and that will be fed through Holland to the UK. And then of course you are in the threat of being blackmailed by all kinds of interests. So there's the authors, and well, open to any questions.
Well, thanks very much, Robert. We've got a question straight off here and another one in the front, so that's good.
Depends on the question.
Depends on the questions. Well,
it's Robert Evans from Cenex. Very good presentation, very thorough piece of work. Can we refer back to slide 17? So there were two bullets here that the challenge from other sectors and the learnings from other sectors is that the third bullet down and the final bullet are unfortunately mutually incompatible. So it says the policy incentives that lay a level playing field for hydrogen fuel cells and then retain funding research on hydrogen fuel cells. Well, maybe they're not compatible, but the challenge that other sectors have had is that government has provided policy incentives, but policy incentives are unnecessarily short-term and government can't make commitments for them, and they come and they go. So it's really, really difficult to say the intent of the third bullet is to have a policy that is a level playing field for a consistent period of time, because it's the stability that industry needs. But the problem is that the stimulus support that comes in, by definition, that the sector also needs, is very spiky and chops and changes and can't be so easily relied on. And that puts people off investing because they expect, I'll have a grant to invest in a car or a station or so on. And then that grant, they don't know if they've got it, so people feel that they can't invest because of the prospect of public funding coming in. So is there further work that you'll do in this area as part of the Supergem project? Is there learning from other sectors? Is there ways that we can define what sits in the third bullet to try to separate out that from what sits in the fifth bullet, so that we don't have a situation where in the intersection of the two you have an inherent incompatibility?
Right. I'd rather say the third and the fourth bullet. But so the fifth bullet essentially is sort of what will the next generation be. So it's the research. You may or may not know I'm not a fan of demonstration projects. So I'm not really a fan of all these large-scale European projects shelling out a lot of money for Daimler, for building buses they'll never sell, not for the next 5 years. So what we are talking about here is the level playing field. Say at government level, all the cost analysis is done at a societal cost level and not consumer price. So you're not concerned about what the consumer pays, you're concerned what the consumer as a taxpayer pays. And that's what you look at. So you don't do the economic evaluation with whatever the pump price or the energy service price is, you do it at the societal level. That would be the game changer, because then you have other choices. Maybe we're not even at a par, I don't know. We've never really, well, we did this for the petrol and diesel vehicles. I haven't done that for heating. We do need market introduction programs because we have to overcome this. But the strategy, so the fourth point essentially is about the government adopting a different strategy and having a different way of looking at economies. And that would give you this long-term strategy automatically. Whereas everything else, as you said, is short-lived, and then there's, I don't know, 1,000 units are funded, and then it's just pointless. It doesn't really help.
John Saltmarsh from Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Robert, thanks very much for that presentation. It was fascinating. Can we just go back, I think it's probably the next slide back, with your comparison, yeah, this is the one, comparison of hydrogen costs to diesel costs. And am I right in saying that the diesel costs at the moment include the cost of taxation?
Yep.
So it's not really a fair comparison when your costs of hydrogen, you're saying, are 2 to 1. When in reality, the majority of the diesel cost
But the hydrogen is also taxed.
You've included a hydrogen tax?
Yeah.
At what sort of rate?
Couldn't say now. We did this quite a while ago, but it was as it would be taxed at a filling station.
Right, okay, because normally when I see this comparison, it's basically a sort of, well, the prices are much the same, but then we totally ignore the cost of actually the income to the Treasury.
It's fully taxed. The point you can make, of course, in the diesel price as it is now, the pump price, of course, there is taxation. There's a part that it could be considered as external cost. That's correct, yeah.
Right. Well, in which case, if it's taken into account, I don't have a question, because that's fine.
No, it's
the back there, and then we'll come down to the front, and then I think we'll move on.
Lewis Clitheroe, Office for Low Emissions Vehicles. Early on in the presentation you mentioned there's no efficiency limit for fuel cells. When this isn't the case, they're limited by their overpotential, which is part of how they deal with ion transport. So I think what I'm trying to say is, how unfair is it to compare thermal processes to electrochemical processes when you're really comparing apples to oranges? And is this misleading enough that it could lead to a backlash in public opinion?
No, it's not misleading, it's correct, because you're comparing it to thermodynamical level. And thermodynamically, your Carnot efficiency just limits. I mean, you can plot it, and power stations today are 600, 700 degrees centigrade. That's the highest you can get with the materials. Gives you something like 56, 60% efficiency. The overpotential is a function of materials properties. All I was saying was you can infinitely improve the materials properties. There's no theoretical limit.
Well, there is, because you have to transport ions to separate
yes, but if
protons from hydroxide ions.
Yes, but there's no physical limit that says this has a whatever limiting efficiency.
That's assuming that you can make ions travel faster than the speed of light. Yeah, they have to transport somewhere. They have to take time to do that. There is always an efficiency limit when it comes to fuel cells. It's just determined differently. What I'm saying is it misleading to use an apples for oranges comparison?
There's no theoretical efficiency limit. Of course, technically there is a limit. But if you, for instance, well, it's just purely hypothetical. If you took a superconductor and made a fuel cell out of that, the ohmic resistance would be very close to zero, and you'd have whatever 99-point-something% efficiency. It's not practically viable. But if you plot the efficiency of a fuel cell with overpotential, it's a straight line. So theoretically, you could reach 100%.
Okay, this is something for the networking session. These are rather complicated physics arguments. I think there's one more question here, and then we're going to move on to the next section. Thank you very much.
I wouldn't harp too much on that argument. It's just sort of showing that you can go higher, and it's possible to go to 80% actually.
Okay.
Hello, Kevin Fothergill from the Hydrogen Hub. On one of the slides you had a cost of CO2 at £250. Just a question of clarification really. Could you tell me what the basis of that particular number is?
Paul, it's your fault.
That's kind of typical 2050 for energy system models. We have, I think, £300 per ton.
Okay, I guess my point is that the attractiveness of fossil fuels and/or hydrogen can vary depending on what number you choose. So it needs a very robust basis to choose something to make a comparison with. And I just wondered if is that in the paper, for example, the detail of that?
Yeah.
I don't think we have the cost curves for the various scenarios in the paper, but it is based on typical work that's come out over the last few years from scenario studies.
There's a development from now to 2050, which assumes a certain growth in carbon dioxide taxes.
Okay, so there's a clear assumption, but it's not necessarily based on.
So these are the costs as forecast as well as you can in 2050.
It's basically, as I understand it from the UCL model, it's the costs, the carbon price that emerges from meeting the UK's climate change commitments by 2050. So if you constrain carbon emissions in the UK, that's the kind of implicit price of carbon that comes out of that.
Okay, thank you.
The very last one, and then we're going to move on, so we've got Celia Greaves champing at the bit.
It was just a quick comment on the efficiency argument, because efficiencies are always very important, and without sort of complicating things further, I hope, it's never that clear with a fuel cell, because there's always capital cost versus operating costs in there. If your fuel cell is running very highly efficiently, you could actually have a smaller fuel cell and run it less efficiently. So it depends on a full economic analysis of capital versus operating cost. Combustion's not that easy either to analyse, because actually you can increase the temperature of the combustion process. In fact, turbines run at higher and higher temperature nowadays, and that actually increases their efficiency. So in a sense, the upper limit's not clear there either. So they're complicated economic analyses.
It all sounded pretty complicated, but you've just clarified the complications. Right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for that. Thank you, Robert. Thank you to the other presenters.